Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wilson, and I am continuing with recording solo episodes over the summer, addressing messages and emails that you have sent me about particular topics that interest you. Today, I want to have an honest conversation about assessments and something I think many parents quietly wonder about, and you all have emailed me about. Whether they are currently going through the evaluation process, considering one, or trying to make sense of a diagnosis that their child has already received. And that is this: what can an assessment actually tell you? And just as importantly, what can't it tell you? Because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about assessments and diagnoses. Some families enter an assessment hoping for certainty, a definitive answer, a clear explanation, a roadmap for the future. And assessments can absolutely provide incredibly valuable information. They can identify patterns, clarify strengths and challenges a child or a teen might be experiencing. They can explain why a child may be struggling, and they can guide intervention and support. But assessments are not crystal balls, and diagnoses are often much more nuanced than people realize. In fact, one of the most important things I think parents should understand is this: most diagnoses in mental health and neurodevelopment are behaviorally defined, not biologically confirmed. And what I mean by that is that there is no blood test for ADHD, no brain scan that can definitively diagnose anxiety, and there's no single biomarker currently used to clinically diagnose autism. Instead, our diagnoses rely heavily on a developmental history, which is what parents and caregivers tell us about their child's development, what parents report, what teachers observe, how a child presents during the testing session, the child or the teen's self-report of their own experiences, behavioral patterns, and how much those struggles are affecting daily life. And that matters because human beings are complicated. Context matters, environment matters, stress matters, culture, development, and masking all matter. And all of those things can influence whether difficulties are recognized or missed entirely. And I want to pause here because I think that this is really important. When I say diagnoses are behaviorally defined, I am not saying diagnoses are meaningless or made up. Diagnoses can be incredibly helpful. They can provide validation, relief, access to support, language that helps us explain experiences that previously felt really confusing or invisible. But diagnoses are also imperfect frameworks created by human beings to describe clusters of behaviors and experiences. And I don't think people fully understand that. For clinicians, diagnoses help us understand patterns of strengths, struggles, behaviors, and experiences, and we can convey that information to caregivers and educators. But human beings do not always fit neatly into categories. And this becomes especially important when we talk about masking, which we have discussed on the podcast before, and I'm going to put a link to an episode on that in the show notes. Assessments depend partly on what children show us, and some children become very good at hiding how hard things really are. And this is something we frequently see in girls, gifted children, high-achieving students, verbally fluent children, twice exceptional students, and many individuals from marginalized communities. Now, we've talked in previous episodes about ADHD in girls, autistic girls, and twice exceptional students. So I'm not going to go deeply into those topics today, but I will link to those episodes in the show notes. But they are incredibly relevant to this conversation because they highlight one very important reality. The children struggling the most internally are not always the ones drawing the most attention externally. Some children externalize distress, but others internalize it. Some become disruptive and others become perfectionistic. Some visibly fall apart and have meltdowns. Others quietly overwork to keep up. And from the outside, those children can look fine, even when they are expending enormous amounts of energy just to function. And research shows us that many girls and children who are cognitively very strong, consciously or unconsciously develop ways to mask or compensate for social, attention, executive functioning, or emotional difficulties. They study their peers, they mimic social behaviors, they over-prepare, they become highly compliant, they rely heavily on their memory or intelligence, or work twice as hard to avoid appearing like they are struggling. And because many of these children are academically successful or socially compliant, their difficulties are often less visible to adults. In fact, many parents and teachers may unintentionally underreport struggles when a child is getting good grades, behaving appropriately in class, or not disrupting others. That's also incredibly important because many children who are struggling internally do not necessarily look like they are struggling from the outside. So if a child is masking effectively or compensating successfully or silently exhausting themselves to maintain performance, they may not immediately appear to meet criteria for a specific diagnosis, even when the effort required to function is unsustainable. And this is one reason why so many girls and kids with very strong cognitive skills in specific areas are diagnosed later, not because the difficulties suddenly appeared, not because they never had these struggles to begin with, but because their strengths delayed visibility. I think ADHD in girls and women is one of the clearest examples of this. For years, ADHD research focused primarily on boys who displayed more obvious hyperactive and disruptive behaviors. The children leaving their seat, interrupting class, acting impulsively, but many girls presented differently and present differently. They may daydream, appear inattentive, be highly anxious, be perfectionistic, over-prepare, or rely on intelligence and people-pleasing to compensate. And because they are often less disruptive, they are more likely to be overlooked. Research consistently shows that girls are diagnosed later than boys, and many women are not diagnosed until adulthood, sometimes in their 30s or even later. And not because ADHD suddenly appeared, but because the demands of life eventually exceeded the coping strategies that had been holding everything together. And I think that idea is incredibly important. Sometimes difficulties become visible not because a person changed, but because the demands of the environment changed. A bright child may compensate well in elementary school, where life is highly structured. Then middle school happens, or high school, or college, or parenthood. The workload increases, the organizational demands increase, the social expectations become more complex, and the scaffolding decreases. And suddenly, the difficulties become more visible, not because the person became lazy, because they stopped trying, but because the environment now requires capacities that are harder for them to sustain. And this is one reason why profiles can change over time. One assessment is not necessarily the final word on a child forever. Sometimes a child who qualified for extended time at age 8 may no longer need it at age 14 because intervention strengthened the underlying skills. And that's a good thing. A child with dyslexia who's now reading at grade level after years of evidence-based intervention has not lost their history of struggle. It means the intervention worked, it helped, and that is the goal. Support and intervention are supposed to help children grow. At the same time, new concerns can emerge over time. A child who appeared borderline for attention difficulties at age 6 may later clearly meet criteria for ADHD when academic, organizational, and executive functioning demands increase. A child whose early profile was dominated by learning struggles with reading, writing, and math, may later develop significant anxiety after years of working twice as hard to keep up. Sometimes children who initially appeared socially fine begin struggling more noticeably in adolescence when friendships become more nuanced and socially demanding. Again, profiles evolve because children develop, environments change, demands increase, coping strategies shift, and life experiences change. And this is where I think many parents and educators may misunderstand assessments. Because again, a misconception I see is the belief that if a child does not meet full criteria for a diagnosis, then nothing needs to happen. But mental health and neurodevelopment do not work that way. There are sometimes provisional diagnoses. There are children with meaningful struggles that do not meet full criteria yet. There are children who never meet full criteria but still need support. There are children who are coping externally while struggling significantly internally. And all of that information matters. In fact, some assessments are most valuable when they help us identify vulnerabilities early, when they help us identify a child's strengths in areas where they need additional support. Because not meeting criteria should never automatically be interpreted as everything is fine. A child can still struggle significantly with attention, anxiety, executive functioning, social understanding, emotional regulation, or learning, even if they don't meet full diagnostic criteria at a specific moment in time. And often those early signs tell us what to monitor, what supports may help, what interventions may help reduce future risk, and how to better understand what a child is experiencing currently. That's incredibly valuable information. A good assessment looks at far more than test scores, and that's why it needs to, because again, individuals are complex. So a good evaluation will consider developmental history, behavioral observations, emotional functioning, school experiences, social patterns, family history, stress, coping strategies, and how a child or a teen is functioning in different settings, school and home. Because numbers on testing alone never tell the whole story. Two children can present very differently while struggling with similar underlying issues. And two children can share the same diagnosis while functioning completely differently because of strengths, personality, environment, support systems, stress levels, and different life experiences. All of that matters. And that's why strengths are just as important to identify in an evaluation as areas where children or teens need support. And another thing about an assessment, it should never reduce a child to a list of deficits or weaknesses. A good assessment helps explain how a child learns, how they cope, what supports them, what overwhelms them, what motivates them, and where their strengths may become protective factors. Strengths matter because they shape resilience, confidence, identity, relationships, problem solving, and long-term functioning in complex environments. And sometimes strengths are also the very thing that masks difficulties. A child with exceptional verbal reasoning may hide reading comprehension struggles longer than expected. A student with high problem-solving abilities may compensate for executive functioning weaknesses for years. Creativity, humor, social awareness, or strong memory skills may help children navigate environments in ways that make their struggles seem less visible to adults, which is why labels should guide support and not limit expectations. So an assessment should help us understand a child or a teen more deeply, not reduce them to a category, not define their worth, and certainly not determine what they are capable of becoming. I think it's important to remember that assessments capture a child or a teen's functioning at a specific moment in time. They're snapshots, very valuable snapshots, but still snapshots. Children develop, brains develop, environments change, stress changes, and supports change, and people change, which means assessments, which are very valuable for understanding a child's strengths, challenges, and the type of support that is needed, are not meant to predict an entire future. They are meant to help us understand the present so we can make informed decisions about how to support children and teens moving forward. And honestly, one of the most important things an assessment can do is help a child and a family feel understood. Help a child feel not lazy, not dramatic, not too much, not broken, understood. Sometimes the biggest relief comes not from a label itself or a diagnosis, but from finally having language that makes sense of experiences that previously felt invisible. So if you're considering an assessment for your child or teen, I want you to know this. An assessment will provide valuable information, but it may not answer every question. But a thoughtful, comprehensive assessment can provide clarity, direction, insight, and a much deeper understanding of how a child experiences the world. And if you have already been through the assessment process, I hope this conversation reminds you that no diagnosis can fully capture the complexity of a human being. Remember that no test score can measure creativity, humor, kindness, resilience, potential, or future possibility. Children and teens are always bigger than their profiles. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Diverse Thinking, Different Learning. If this conversation resonated with you, please share it with another parent, educator, or clinician, because I think these are conversations we need to have more openly and thoughtfully. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.